Morning. Morning. So I want to talk a little bit about understanding the context in which all the news stories that we read day after day from the Middle East. From my standpoint, I start in this book, Embracing Israel, Palestine, and in Tikkun magazine. Tikkun, by the way, didn't mention last night, is a word that means, it's a Hebrew word that means healing, repair, transformation. And so we are about Tikkun Olam, the Hebrew concept of transforming and healing and repairing the world. Though Tikkun magazine is an interfaith magazine, and also, as I mentioned, open to people who are spiritual but not religious, atheists, etc. So how do we do a tikkun in the Middle East? Well, the first thing we have to recognize is the fundamental humanity of both sides. We have to acknowledge in a way that our media and our government and the government of Israel does not, and the leadership of the Palestinian people do not do, is to acknowledge the humanity of the other, and in this case, humanity of both sides, and recognize that whatever has happened not because we have evil people or satanic forces. And actually, this is how the story gets told in the United States. It gets told in Israel. It gets told in Palestine. It gets told in most of the world. It gets told as the good guys versus the bad guys. And it's not true. So how in the world are we going to break through that? Well, the first thing, very important thing for you as potential spiritual progressives, or maybe you're actual spiritual progressives, is to be able to know enough about the story so that when people come at you, if you say, hey, I'm part of a movement that seeks reconciliation and peace, and they come at you and say, no, that's impossible because this side is all screwed up and that side is really the righteous victims versus the evil oppressors, that you know that the story is much more complicated and that you can explain it a little bit to people. So that's in part what the book does, and what I'm going to just quickly try to highlight a few points of in this talk. So the first thing is to understand that this struggle has not been going on for the past several thousand years. This is part of the general discourse. That it is not true that Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims have been fighting forever. Not at all. On the contrary, through much of the Middle Ages, while Jews were being oppressed in the Christian world and demonized because we were supposedly the killers of the Messiah, of the Son of God, the Muslims, to our benefit, did not have a theology that said we killed God. So Jews lived in relative harmony with the Muslims in Muslim countries. Now, there were fundamental inequalities of power. The conditions that the Jews lived in were vaguely analogous to apartheid conditions. So it wasn't perfect, but on the other hand, it was a lot better than living in the Christian world, where every Easter, gangs of Christians would come into the Jewish sections, the Jewish ghettos, the places where Jews had been allowed to live, and would go seek to kill, to rape, to murder, to burn, to attack these terrible God killers. So it's not true that there was always this problem. The problem emerged in the 19th century when most Jews were living in Eastern Europe, and the Tsar of Russia in 1880 declared that that the Jewish problem had to be dealt with, and his proposal was 1/3 of all Jews should be expelled from the country, 1/3 of all Jews should be forced to convert to Christianity, and 1/3 of all Jews should be killed. Now, this was not something that was very happy-making for Jewish people. And a lot of the people that you know as Jews in this country, their grandparents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents came to this country in the period 1880 to 1924, escaping from Russia or from the lands that Russia had conquered, which included Poland and much of Eastern Europe, came here looking for refuge. And that's how a very significant section of Jews dealt with this issue. Others moved to Western Europe, where they became the immigrants, the evil other immigrants that then were demonized by local nationalist movements in Germany and France and Italy and Poland and so forth. A small section of the Jewish people decided that actually the solution to our problem was to find finally a state of our own, to have to recreate a national existence that we had in Palestine. Even the name, of course, is one imposed on us by imperialism, in that case, Roman imperialism, that we needed to have our own state because we had been kicked around and oppressed in country after country all around the world. So a small group of Jews decided to go back to our ancient homeland and to try to create a Jewish homeland there. And unfortunately, that small group, and I'm saying small group, I'm talking about a few thousand people at first, went back to what was then Palestine under Ottoman rule. The Turks ruled the area at that time, and tried to create settlements. And often those settlements were socialist in nature. They're called kibbutzim, the kibbutz. Small socialist ventures. They were not welcomed with open arms by the people who were living there, by the Arab population that was living there. And quickly there developed antagonism between the two sides. Now, why was that? Well, from the standpoint of Palestinians, or those who had not yet identified themselves as Palestinians, but identified themselves as the Arab nation, the Jews who were coming were Westerners, and they had had an experience of the West from coming to their Holy Land from the Crusades. And the Crusades was a time in which Westerners had invaded the Middle East, conquered part of it, and in that conquest had for 150 years established a Crusader state that was extremely oppressive and violent towards the Arab populations there. Now that was, you might say, wait a second, wasn't that 600 years before? And so this is another element in the story that is hard for Americans to grasp, because most of us have a little trouble remembering what really went on 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we think of ancient history as the founding of our country in 76, 80, whatever, however you want to date it. That's the old days, right? But so it seems like, what are these people holding on to something from 600 years? But both Jews and Arabs, Israel, Muslims, and other cultures around the world have a much longer historical memory. And so the experience of the Crusades was one framework within which they saw Jews coming there. But that was just the historical part. The second part was that there was a reality going on of that in the late 19th century, European countries, particularly Britain and France, and to a lesser extent Germany and Italy, and to some extent the United States, were conquering the world, were colonizing the world, were taking over the world, including much of the Middle East and Africa and as much of Asia as we could grab. And for the United States, it was South America and Central America. So in this colonial period, it was fairly easy for people to come to believe that the Jews were, who were coming there were coming as part of this larger colonial venture and were essentially agents of the European powers. So that was the second reason why they weren't greeted with open arms. The third reason was that the society at that time, in the Arab societies of the Middle East, and including in Israel, in what is now Israel-Palestine, were dominated by a small elite of Arab landowners. And those landowners were, had a feudal arrangement with the people who lived in those lands. And they were very, very unhappy about the idea of a group of Europeans who would bring capitalist values, including values like democracy and equality before the law, to a feudal society that they were running. All the worse when they figured out that these people were coming were not capitalists, but socialists who wanted to share the land in a whole different way. So they had a stake in turning the people who lived there against these new immigrants. And the way that they did that was by saying, they controlled the means of communication. Now, we're talking about 1880 to 1920s. In that period, the people didn't have radio. The vast majority of Arabs living in that land were illiterate. They didn't read newspapers. There weren't very many newspapers, and they didn't read. The most of the information came through the mosques, and the landowners appointed those people who were going to be the spokespeople in the mosques, and they gave out the following message: these people are coming to uproot you and destroy you. They want to take your land. They want to throw you out. A scary message that led to a great deal of tension. Now, that's why there was a huge misperception and resistance to Jews coming to that land. Now, on the other hand, why didn't the Jews who were coming make a huge effort to reach out to the Palestinian people, to try to explain, or to the Arab peoples living there, try to explain why they were coming, what they were about? Well, so there are some reasons. Number one, the Jews who were coming were part of a larger Jewish community that had, over the course of 2,000 years of exile, come to the conclusion that the non-Jews, the Goyim, Goy means nation, the nations, the Goyim, always hated us. So when we met resistance, when Jews met resistance coming back to their ancient homeland, they didn't think, gee, isn't this peculiar? Maybe we should talk to people and explain who we are, etc. They thought, what's new? Nothing's new here. This is the same picture. In fact, this is why we need a homeland of our own, is because wherever we go, we're met with hostility. Wherever we go, we're met with resistance. So it doesn't seem surprising to us, nor does it seem like something that we could fix in some way. Secondly, for those who did listen a little bit to what the story was that was being given, the story of, oh, you are representatives of colonialism, you're coming here as to represent European colonialism. Well, this seemed to confirm the absolute futility of trying to have a conversation, because Jews were the primary victim of European colonialism throughout most of of our history. We had been the major evil other in Europe for at least 1,600 years. We had been the major ones being assaulted. So it simply didn't compute. It seemed like complete craziness to think that what we were doing was coming there to represent Europe, when actually we were coming there to flee Europe. And we were fleeing, as I say, mostly to the United States and to Britain and France and Germany, to South Africa and to Australia. And so it seemed totally crazy to Jews to believe that others could see us as anything but the victims rather than the representatives of. I mean, imagine if when African Americans started to come to the North during and after the First World War, if one of the arguments put against them was, oh, you're coming here to colonize the North for the South. Well, wait a second, what are you talking about? We're trying to run away from the South because of how we're treated there. So here you've got two groups of people who misunderstand each other and see each other through the framework of their own historical experience. And their historical experience leads them to fundamentally distrust each other from the start. And then, step after step, and in the development of these two peoples, each side acts in ways that confirm the worst fantasies of the other. And in particular, the extremists on both sides, the ones on both sides, you see, so that then the resistance of Palestinians to Jews coming there confirms the view of the most extreme nationalist visions inside the Jewish world that say, you know, the only way we're going to ever have a homeland for ourselves is if we do expel or if we do push out these Palestinians who are living here and have our own state. Now, that was a minority position in the Zionist movement right up through the creation of the state to the creation of the state of Israel some 65 years ago in 1948. But it was a position which started to grow in credibility as the resistance from Palestine became stronger and stronger and stronger. And particularly during and after the Second World War, when the Palestinian people resisted Jewish immigration, but meanwhile, Jews less than 1,000 miles away are being murdered in the millions, and one of the few places, and the rest of the world shuts its doors, including the United States, turns away Jews in boats that are coming here as refugees, and the United States turns them away and says, no, you can't come here. And so similarly, Canada, so similarly, every other country in the world, no country was willing to open its gates to the fleeing, to the Jews who had any mechanism for fleeing Europe. There was no country in the world that would open their gates. But here was the nearest country that they plausibly could have gone to, and the Arab world had convinced Britain, who by that point had a mandate to control the Middle East, to not allow any of those fleeing Jews to come to Palestine. And the way they convinced them was by saying, well, we won't. You need our oil to fight this war, the Second World War. We won't let you have it if you don't make a blockade and keep those Jews out of Palestine. So from the standpoint of the Jews at the time, our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, our family are being murdered, and you are telling us that Jews can't come here. Not that nobody can come here. It's not like you're saying there isn't any space here. It's not like this is Manhattan and there's no more room to put here. Anybody else, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever, they can come. Jews can't come here. So that experience was part of what contributed to the insensitivity of those Israelis who in 1948 struggled to create the State of Israel, and then were, in the course of that, pushed out, at first not necessarily thinking that this would be permanent, but pushed out some 800,000 Palestinians who became Palestinian refugees, a population that's now grown to over 4 million of the descendants of those people many of them living in some of the most horrific conditions of anyone on the planet Earth. And the Israelis, after that war, after the 48 war, instead of saying to those who had fled or those fled the fighting, hey, come on back. You can come back now to your homes. Instead, it said, no, you can't come back. You have no right to return to your homes, which was a violation of international law, to be sure, since refugees have, under international law, the right to return. but from the standpoint of Israelis, return, those are the people who have a place to go. If we had been losing this war, we have no place to go except where the Arab leadership says they want us, namely in the sea, to drown. There is no place that will take us in, so we have no other place to go. So from the standpoint of the Israelis, these will be people who, if we let them back in, will destroy our society, because that's why they aligned with our enemies, and so we can't let them back in. And from the standpoint of Palestinians, wait a second, we just were fleeing to be outside a war zone. We weren't going because we wanted to see you necessarily destroyed. We just didn't want to be caught in the middle of the war. And Israelis respond, yeah, but we didn't have any place to go. But Palestinians say, okay, so what that we had a place to go? We still want to come back to our homes. You see what I'm talking about here? How you could understand, and this is the critical part, that we need to understand the humanity of each side and recognize that each side has a legitimate discourse. Each side has a legitimate story to tell. And so it develops. It goes on and on and on, in which the actions of each side are interpreted as proving the worst fantasies of the extremists of the other side. And this has continued right up to our own day, so that even today, when we talk about the Palestinian people, we have to recognize now that there really are two Palestinian peoples being represented. On the one hand, those who support the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for the past 7 to 8 years has been unequivocally opposed to violence, has cooperated with the Israeli Defense Forces and the secret services of the Israeli people to block any terrorist attacks. And on the other hand, the Hamas located in Gaza, which still articulates a strategy of we need armed struggle to destroy or overturn Israel so that there will not be a Jewish state in this area. And of course, the extremists on the Israeli side, who at this point are running the government, take the position that there's no talking about a peace settlement when half of the Palestinian people are supporting Hamas, and Hamas is seeking to destroy us. Okay, so you're seeing the complexity of this reality. Now, is it true that Hamas is seeking to destroy them? Well, it's true that they say that, but it's also true that in every struggle, when it appears as if nothing is really possible, then some of the most extreme elements get to articulate a total victory over and destruction of the evil other. So if you, for example, look at the anti-war movement in the 1960s in our own country, you'll see that as Nixon became more and more entrenched in advancing that war and potentially using nuclear weapons, the most democratic and love-oriented elements of the anti-war movement receded in public attention, and what public attention tended to focus on were the weathermen, a tiny little group of people inside the anti-war movement that probably represented not more than 1,000 or 2,000 of the 10 to 12 million people who identified publicly with the anti-war movement, according to a poll that was taken in 1968 by Fortune magazine. So, but those few thousand people were used by the Nixon administration to say, hey, the whole thing is about these extremists who want to destroy America. Were there extremists who wanted to destroy America? There were some. But were they what we were about as a whole? No. But why did they have credibility even amongst those anti-war activists who were against violence? Because as the situation became more and more desperate and it seemed less and less likely that the government was going to listen to anything that we said, then the plausibility of extremism seem to rise, not because their strategy ever made any sense, but simply out of desperation, wanting to say, I don't have a nice way to say this. We want to hurt you. We want to hurt you. We don't care about you, America, because you are doing something so terrible. Well, it's that sentiment that an oppressed group, as for example, today, the Palestinian people, gets to express by saying, we want to see Israel destroyed. Whereas if you talk to Palestinians, and there's plenty of poll data that shows this, if the Palestinians were offered a plausible and just settlement of their struggle, the vast majority would accept it. And that vast majority would not only accept it, but do and support what the government of Mohammed Abbas and the Palestinian Authority has been doing for the past 8 years, namely actively cooperate in suppressing those elements that are violent and hurtful. Now, some people come back and say, well, wait a second, but that's because the vast majority of those Palestinians who want to cooperate, they're Christians, they're not Muslims. It's not true. The vast majority of those who want to cooperate with Israel and want to live in peace with Israel are Muslims. So, and there's nothing in Muslim ideology, in its fundamentals, that would require the obliteration of Israel. Now you might say, wait a second, but we've heard differently, et cetera. Well, that's because there are always right hand of God interpreters and left hand of God interpreters of every religious tradition. And so what we want to ask is, when people say, well, those Muslim fundamentalists, they do want to destroy, and they feel that there's no room for anybody else on the whole Holy Land but Muslims. Okay, there is such a group. Okay, just as there are there's a group of Jews who believe there's no room for anybody but Jews in the Holy Land. But the question is always, when we go back to right hand, left hand of God consciousness and recognize there are always going to be some people who are closer to the power over domination and control is the only way we get safety. And there are some people who will be much closer to the generosity, kindness, compassion, caring for others view. So the political question is always, how do you move the population towards one side or the other? How does that consciousness shift? And clearly what's happened, when people talk about the Islamic fundamentalists and the most extreme ones getting more support, it has happened precisely because the side that is for more caring, more generosity, etc., can deliver nothing. So this is true in general for all fundamentalist realities. If you look at any fundamentalist reality, you'll see that same issue, that when the despair is highest, when it looks least likely that one can build a world based on love and caring and generosity, that's when the fundamentalist worldviews start to appear to be much more plausible, and more people go there. So if you go back to, for example, the late 1980s or early 1990s, there were very tiny segment of the Palestinian people were Muslim fundamentalists. It has grown in direct proportion to the failure of a peace process, to be embraced. And the central reason for the failure of that peace process was the murder of Rabbi, the Prime Minister of Israel, who wanted that peace, and murdered not by a Muslim fundamentalist, but by a Jewish fundamentalist who believed that the whole of the land of Israel belonged to the Jewish people and that we should hold it forever. So the way to change how many people are going to identify with the most extreme visions of domination, control, wipe out the other as the only path to security is to build up the forces in each side that call for reconciliation. But the only way that those forces can be built up is if you get a willingness on the part of both sides to make compromises to take steps toward genuine reconciliation. Now, in my view, at the present moment, the primary obstacle to that is the government of Israel. But I don't want to say that in such a way as to suggest that the vast majority of Israelis would fight to the end to keep every inch of territory. Because just as there are polls that will show you that, there are polls that show you the contrary. That if people really believed in the possibility of peace, okay, if they really believed in the possibility of reconciliation, if they really believed in the left hand of God. So how does that happen? Well, to make a long story very short, because I only have a few minutes left, I want to say to you, it's the same way that we talked about last night in terms of transforming the consciousness of the Western world. There have to be people who are out there saying, yes, I believe in the possibility of a world based on kindness and generosity, and I want those policies to prevail. Now, inside Israel, you'd be amazed at how much the political consciousness is similar to the political consciousness in this country, in which the progressive forces and the reconciliation forces have this despairing view that says, the rest of the population, they'll never even listen to us. So there's no point in even talking that. So, a tragic reality is that the peace forces in Israel have divorced themselves from the religious traditions and the spiritual traditions, which actually have within them a foundation for a worldview of peace and generosity. So when people look at Israel, they say, oh, well, it's those extremist religious people. But actually, the vast majority, 80% of the population, is secular. And they continue to vote for regimes that don't make that reconciliation. And the peace people do not reach out to others in a language that can speak to the hopes, the aspirations. Instead, they say there's no point in this because everybody is stuck where they are. Sound familiar? That's just how most of us think about the United States, about people being stuck. So what could break this logjam? At this historical moment, it seems to me unlikely that in the next few years, possibly the next decade, there will emerge a force in Israel that is capable of doing that, unless there emerges a force capable of doing that in the United States. And so I come back to the global Marshall Plan and the strategy of generosity. Because if we in this country, where we're not surrounded by hostile other states, where we're not surrounded by Syria and the craziness that's going on there in Lebanon and so close to Iran and so forth, where we don't have any plausible enemy, no one that could actually possibly destroy the United States of America. In this situation, we should be able to develop a strategy of generosity. This is a moment when the United States, before we have a huge economic and political decline in this country, we could become the beacon to the world for a new way of dealing with political realities. Now you might say, okay, let's imagine the United States were to adopt a strategy of generosity rather than a strategy of domination. Why would that have any effect on Israel-Palestine? These people are locked into their struggles. And the answer is, well, let me say from my own personal experience. 40 years ago, when I was working on a kibbutz in Israel, I mentioned the feminist movement. Everybody thought that was the most ludicrous thing they'd ever heard of. Today, I mean, it was as far away from the mainstream of Israeli culture as could possibly believe. Today, Israel is one of the most enlightened countries in the world on feminist issues and on gay and lesbian issues. It is far in advance of almost any country in the world, certainly of the United States, on those issues. But what happened was that transformation came from the United States and came from the West. And then the ideas were adopted by many Israelis who want to be part of the cultural, let's say, the cultural vanguard in the world. And so if the United States were to begin to take a serious embracing of a strategy of generosity, there would be a tremendous ripple effect, I believe, not just on Israel, but in fact on the Arab world and on the rest of the world. A tremendous transformation of consciousness would occur within a period of 20, 30 years, just as occurred with the women's movement, just as occurred with gay and lesbian movements. A tremendous transformation of consciousness. But this, unfortunately, brings us back to you. Now you want to say, who, me? Come on, I just came to a conference. And isn't this my political work? I showed up here. I did my part. I came to the conference, right? I've listened to these fantastic presentations by wonderful speakers who envision a world in which the God energy of the universe flows up and becomes manifest. And so I've done my part. And unfortunately, there's more to be done. That we need you. And I say, now I'm speaking we as a rabbi, as a Jew, we need you to come out of your closet as spiritual progressives, to go out into the public sphere, to get your local city council to endorse the Global Marshall Plan and the strategy of generosity, to get friends to go with you, to your council people to get that endorsed, to go to your Congress people and ask them to endorse the Global Marshall Plan that's being introduced and has been introduced into Congress, to go to your state legislatures and ask them to pass resolutions in favor of that. We need you to be an activist in the world in articulating and pushing for not only the Global Marshall Plan, but the strategy of generosity that lies behind it. To stand up to the skeptics, to stand up to your local newspapers that will ridicule it at first and editorialize it in silly ways that distort what it's about. We, the Jewish people, need you to become articulators of the possibility of a world based on love, on kindness, on generosity and compassion, and to be able to tell the story of why even in a place like the Middle East, where it seems most implausible, it's actually quite plausible, and why people need not be stuck. That's why I urge you to read the Embracing Israel-Palestine. I urge you to join our network of spiritual progressives, which has as one of its concomitant benefits that you get Tikkun magazine for free as part of your joining the network of spiritual progressives, spiritualprogressives.org on the web, and to become part of a new movement that takes spirituality out of the synagogue, out of the churches, out of the mosques, out of the ashrams, and into the public life of our society. Thank you. Okay.